that I have over the past 5 years, I think, from the PhD level. And then with the masters, there's quite a number. There's close to about 22. And I'm hoping you can have a look at some of these topical areas because it makes sense why I'm talking about qualitative research. Some of these topics span into looking at religious beliefs, homosexual orientation. Others look at, the Tokolosh, the role of mythical creatures in mental health. And I know that's quite a shocking topic. Some of you are even laughing, but in the South African context, from a psychology perspective, we cannot exclude the role of indigenous knowledge systems, of cultural veneers, cultural discourses and narratives in how we go about understanding and interpreting mental health symptoms. So it becomes very important for us then as researchers to identify these gaps and then to start addressing them, as hysterical, funny, or scary as these topics may be. And over the years, I have published quite extensively in these areas. But the reason why I placed that information for you and presented that information is that it paints a picture about who I am as a researcher. Essentially what it says to you is that my topical area has taken me more into the area of a constructivist framework, rather than being positioned on a positivist end of this paradigmatic shift. Essentially what this then means for me as an individual is I'm located in wanting to understand the deeper meaning, the rich lived experiences that exist amongst people. Because within sociocultural contexts, you have diversity of meaning. You have different understandings. And it's through these qualitative or constructivist explanations that we are able to actually make some headway or to go deeper than what the numbers actually say to us. So numbers, dear students, can be read discursively. You can go deeper, but it's the constructivist framework that enables one to really look for deeper meaning and to really dig deeper. And this being the qualitative framework implies that the way in which you collect your data is significantly different from how you would collect your data if you were, for example, doing a survey or pushing out a particular scale and collecting quantitative information, okay? So I've prepared a few tips in terms of preparing yourself as an interviewer, both personally as well as in terms of for your participant. And I put this picture here because if you can see it, it's quite funny. There's this person, if you know him, he played Dawson in Dawson's Creek many, many years ago. But he's basically saying, I shaved for this interview. When I got to the interview, the person interviewing me had a beard. And it's quite interesting because often before we get into the field or before we get involved in a certain topic or interaction with someone, we have these preconceived notions and ideas, these assumptions that will almost guide the way in which we interact with said individual. But sometimes those assumptions and those thoughts are not based on reality or fact. They're based on what we think the world actually looks like from their perspective. And more often than not, we perceive the world based on our own lived experiences, our worldviews, and the world around us. So essentially what you view as reality is very different from my view of reality, even though we may be in the same room at the same time listening to the same lecture. The sort of information you choose to process and internalize or interpret will depend on where you are at in that particular point in time. Your emotional well-being, your psychological status, what you're thinking, financially where you are at, your stress levels, all of that may influence the sort of information or concentration that you give to the other person, okay? So there's a lot of personal preparation, I think, that needs to take place generally before you get involved in data collection. But with qualitative information and data collection, you unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, you unfortunately have to position yourself as an individual first and foremost in relation to the topic and in relation to the sort of information that is to emerge. So if I give you an example right in the onset, as a researcher, my area is, I'm going to talk about religion and culture, and I like to look at witchcraft beliefs and supernatural beliefs, spirit possession, and its hold on mental health. But I'm coming from the perspective that I believe that these spiritual beliefs or these cultural veneers are influencing how people view mental health. So when it comes to interviewing participants, I've already got a particular set of assumptions that say to me The information coming out from these participants have to, in fact, reflect what you believe. So I may even start directing or steering the conversation by the sorts of questions that I ask, those leading questions. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind as we're going along. But also in terms of personal preparation, before I talk about tips for qualitative data management, I think it's important for you to understand as a student that preparation for research and data collection also implies preparation for feedback. And I'm not sure in the other sessions if you have touched on this. I see some of my postgrad students are looking up at me and almost giving me a smirk on the side here, because feedback is not as glamorous as we make it out to be. It's feedback, but it's actually very painful. And as a student, you're unfortunately going to have to sit with those very uncomfortable feelings that my supervisor said that paragraph 2 on page 2 is nonsense. They're not going to say it's nonsense, but they'll tell you in a, using academic jargon that this paragraph can be deleted or just move it, take it out. And how do you feel? Because that paragraph you spent probably 3 weeks writing, reading 40 journal articles, and your supervisor is now taking it out. And 2 weeks later, when you resubmit your reworked proposal, your revised proposal, without that information, guess what happens? Your supervisor asks you to put that information back in. All right? So this is also something I feel as a student, you have to qualitatively prepare yourself for. You have to do some sort of self-reflection to understand that while I am paving forward towards the completion of my study, I also need to understand that every step of the way is going to be monitored, evaluated, and critiqued. And not a critique on myself, but a critique on the work I'm producing. Okay, so the video I'm about to show you is something that took place with a master's student of mine, post me giving her feedback. So I emailed her feedback, I used track changes quite a bit, and I sent her this proposal document. She vanished for about 3 days. There was silence. I heard nothing. I followed up to find out where is the student, but absolutely nothing. And it was about 7:30 one evening, I get this WhatsApp message, and the student had literally just made a little tiny video. Not the piece that I'm attached to, because we turned it into a bit of a parody video for social media. But in this message was the student attaching my feedback, and she's just clicking through it like a little video. And she attached this voice that says, each time I come here, I feel abused. That was her feedback to me in terms of me asking, how are you doing? Okay. And it was at that point that I realized we give feedback from the position as a supervisor, not realizing the impact it actually has qualitatively and emotionally on our students. And that in itself can become a barrier between you as a student and your supervisor. So at the onset of your study, internalize that your supervisor is not your enemy. And that even if they tell you delete those paragraphs, they mean it in the best of ways. My students are giving me some very interesting smirks on the side. So I'm going to play this video. It's a little funny.
Each time when I come here, I am abused.
So, yeah, I just used this video, and the reason why I put it together is I realized many students are actually going through this. And when I posted it online, the number of direct messages I received from postgrad students saying, help, we are receiving this feedback, we're not quite sure what to do. And that is why I'm saying this to you. At the onset of your study, make sure you prepare yourself for that. Okay. So some of the fun parts aside, and the jokes aside, I think the first step you need to keep in mind when you are working on your qualitative data collection is to keep in mind the aim and objectives of your study. I know there was a session where the aim and objectives were, explicated very, very clearly. And I think it's important as a student, you very deeply understand your aim and objectives. If you do, you will get a sense of where your methodology is going, the paradigms, the epistemologies you are using, the design that follows, and how to go about designing questions that are relevant to helping you answer the aim and the objectives. Is that making sense, guys? And remember that your objectives are the action tasks that you have to put in place to ensure that the overall aim of the study is achieved, okay? So now you have to, in your interview schedule, remember this interview guide I'm talking about, is very different from the interview question that is set for your research. You have an overall research question that guides the overall research process, but you need to create an interview guide or interview schedule, which is a series of shorter questions, open-ended questions, maybe some closed-ended questions that enable you to probe and to get deeper information that is rich in meaning from your participants on a very specific area of investigation. So it's important for you to, when you are constructing these questions, almost think about it very logically. How am I going to logically and practically sit with this person? Where are my participants located? What is the population I'm working with? Is my population within a community setting? If it's in a community setting, can I put on a suit and tie? How do I dress for my interviews? Because I'm going to jump very quickly down to the second point rather. Consider cultural and power dimensions of the interview situation. Every interaction between humans is imbued with power, okay? Regardless of who you are. Right now, as a lecturer presenting and giving a talk, I have power in this situation. And you as a student, as an audience member, you have to listen to that. So you're feeding into that power. But that power dynamic shifts. The moment I leave this room, I'm no longer in that power dynamic where I have control over a certain situation, okay? And the same applies to all our lives. In your personal relations, I mean, with your partners, with your girlfriends, your wives, you may have, certain powered moments where you're in control, but you also know when your partner, your girlfriend, your wife is in control and you're not going to challenge that situation, okay? The same thing happens when you enter the data collection process in the field. If you are going to come across as someone who is more powerful than your participant, remember that the participant is going to feel a level of intimidation because they're then viewing you as someone who is better than them, in a better bracket than them, not understanding their issues or problems or their context. And it can be as simple as just the way you are dressed. So as a tip, when you are constructing your interview guide and questions, take into account your research aim and objectives and start working on a series of questions that are both open-ended and closed-ended. Closed-ended questions are important because they give you a definite answer in terms of your candidates or your participants' view on a certain topic. Are you financially stable? Yes or no? But then you can take it deeper. Please explain to me, why do you say that you are not financially stable? Or I'm feeling emotionally vulnerable. Why are you feeling that way? This is the point of qualitative data collection, is carrying that particular information or the response that a participant is giving you and trying to take as much information or gather as much meaning around it. And I hope I'm making sense with the information I'm sharing thus far. Okay, I've spoken a bit about the interview guide. This process is another tip. The one thing I've noticed from my students is you need to practice conducting interviews and your interview schedule. Sit with your supervisor, if you must, or another student, and run through those questions. Because saying the question out aloud is often very different from when you've just typed it out. Just practically, it makes more sense to hear how it will sound. Okay? And secondly, I'm saying consider the cultural and power dimensions of the interview situation. And as a qualitative researcher, you also have to be very reflexive. You have to write down or reflect or constantly refer back to who am I in relation to this data collection process? And what is it that I'm attempting to gain out of this? What are some of the things that are triggering me in this situation? As a quick example, I was collecting data with a student around the Tokolosh, looking at mythical creatures and the role that they actually play in community understandings of mental health and of fear. And we were coming from the perspective knowing or believing or thinking that this is going to have a direct impact. And as the interview progressed, my student came back to me after the first set of interviews and said, but Prof, I'm not getting the depth of meaning or information. It seems that participants are giving superficial answers, but they're not going deeper, even though I'm probing. And we had to reflect to say that what we are talking about is extremely sensitive, very sensitive. And when we went back for the next set of interviews, we added that as a question to say, you're telling us things, but how afraid are you of the Tokolosh? Let's break it down. And that was the opening point for us that shifted how participants were actually giving information. Once we acknowledged that there could be potential fear, they were more willing to open up to us. But also with this topic area, if you come from a community or a context or a culture where this belief is real, you're not going to want to speak about it because you're afraid. You're afraid of the consequences, of the ramifications of what may happen to you. So when you are constructing your interview questions or planning to work with a subset of the population, ask yourself, what could be the potential, sensitivity areas or barriers in collecting this information? All right. Another point that I think you need to keep in mind is remember that you are the co-creator of the data. And this point I cannot emphasize, I cannot even explicate it or be more explicit on this. The reality is that with qualitative information, when you are analyzing the data, the subjectivity is so likely to come in because you're not taking a set of questionnaires, analyzing it and pushing this through SPSS or another quantitative analytic processing tool, where it's going to give you some statistical analysis and you report on that. With your qualitative data, you have to thematize it. And while there are programs like Atlas TI, etc., the issue of power and the issue of the researcher subjectively wanting to have a certain question answered must be kept at bay. Just because you have set out to answer a question does not mean that the data is actually going to speak to that. In fact, if you analyze your data clearly enough or with enough analytical prowess, it is very likely that unanticipated findings will also start emerging, which is very important for you to acknowledge. Okay. Something that I need to learn to do is to talk less and listen more of. But as a lecturer, I guess we have to talk quite a bit. One of the biggest points I can raise, another one is when you are doing an interview, allow your participant to answer. Give them the question and be comfortable sitting with, the discomfort of silence, because that in itself is giving you a response. It's telling you something. I'm not saying at the same time, if your participant goes completely blank or becomes numb, that you just sit there staring at them, doing this whole psychoanalytic, I'm a psychologist, giving you the no, that's not your role. You're not there to give therapy to anyone. You are there as a researcher. So you've got to maintain your role as a critical thinker. I'm being humane to this person in front of me. I'm asking these questions and I'm picking up that this could be something very sensitive, but maybe let me ask another probe. It seems this question is a bit difficult to answer, or are you struggling with that question? Don't be afraid to ask that. You've got to ask more clarity. Because if you don't ask for clarification questions during the data collection process, you will end up like me. What happened during my honors research? I did 12 interviews with faith healers. I did not ask any of those participants a probing question. I then did the transcriptions. I took it to my supervisor and I felt very proud of myself. And she said, well, you're going to re-interview every single participant. Because you asked the question, what is mental illness? And the participant said, it's something that affects how they feel. And you didn't ask, but what does it mean? What do they feel? You just left it at that. You didn't ask any other question. So remember, you may have a question on your interview schedule. It's one question. It gives information, but you need to ask follow-ups, especially if that question is giving information that is not very clear. I hope that's making sense. So that's one of the biggest challenges in qualitative data collection is knowing that you need to probe. If you watch Carte Blanche, you know what I'm talking about. If you remember those days of Devi Sankri, when she would come on TV and shout people, not that I want you to go shouting your participants, but keep that critical, analytical, journalism element to you, that you are there. You've got to aim an objective at the back of your mind. You've got this interview schedule, but at the same time, pay attention to the participant. What are they doing non-verbally? You've got to make notes of that as well. Also, building rapport with your respondents is very important. I know in a post-COVID world, we have to be very sensitive to people's sensitivities as well. So taking into account the need for distance, physicality, distances, all of that, I think we've become a lot more prone to paying attention to. But don't be shy to, when you meet with your participants, also shift and change your language if you must, to adapt to the need and the level of your participant. Okay. In some instances as well, refreshments may be necessary if you're doing focus group discussions. I'm not talking about creating incentives because there's an ethical dilemma there. Are the participants then only participating because you're giving them something, or what sort of information are they giving you? But that is something you would have to sort out with your supervisor depending on the topic and the context within which your data is going to be collected. I've had, with a lot of my studies, a lot of the research takes place in rural settings and communities. So we have to be very careful in terms of how we go about entering those communities, as well as the sort of questions and the language that we utilize. And then, very importantly, please be prepared to handle unanticipated emotions. When you ask people questions on topics, and the research we do usually is not going out there asking people about happiness and joy. We don't research happiness and joy, which I think we actually need to do a lot more of. Asking people, what makes you happy? Instead of all these social ills. But for the most part, you're going to be asking questions about, you know, what are some of the issues or problems or challenges in one's life or in the community? And they are likely to be undealt with, unresolved emotions. Your role as a researcher is not to jump into counseling mode. You will have to contain, but also move through that with the participant very quickly, if that's making sense. In some instances, you may have to stop the interview if the participant is feeling too emotionally sensitized, okay? And last but not least, colleagues and students, you need to also have fun. I think that's the biggest tip that I can give you when it comes to data collection, is put all your steps in place, discuss these things, go through your research protocol, your interview schedules, make sure you understand your research aim and objectives, and the literature that surrounds the topic. And as you embark on this topic, embrace the feedback, embrace the criticality, embrace the challenges that come, because with qualitative work, you have to reflect. You have to write down at the end of this in a certain section, how have you explored and how have you developed? How did you anticipate the study to fold out or unfold? And some of my students in this room will tell you, I've worked with them through their masters and now they're doing their PhDs, that those reflections are often what the examiners are also looking for. When it comes to qualitative data analysis and trustworthiness, they want to get a sense of, but where were you as a researcher? And how did the data actually shift that position? Okay. I'm going to stop at this point. There's quite a bit I can share, but like I said in one of my earlier points, talk less and listen more. So I'm going to open up to some Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ali. Professor, sorry. Is there any questions?
Oops.
Okay, I can see two questions.
Thank you. I think to avoid side eyes later on as a student, I need to ask you something. You did mention something about your students conducting research in rural communities, but I just wanted to ask, maybe even for other students as well who joined us in the platform, in situations where students are conducting research with groups that are not so familiar with, research and rural context being in mind, but also just in general, when you are about to approach people that are not really familiar with what research is, what are some of what is your advice in terms of what is it that you need to consider before going out to approach those people? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Thank you for that, Rebecca. So just to get your question again, in context where participants don't really know or understand what research is, the academic research component, how do we go about engaging? Step one, you are not going to go there as the expert, right? Even though you are an expert in what you're trying to do or developing expertise, the community is an expert in their own lives and their own understanding of their lives. So step one, you've got to negotiate with gatekeepers. Interact first and foremost with gatekeepers. Informally, ask them about how do I get access to the community? Will people be more willing to answer these questions from me or from someone else? Engage in that particular process. And then also when you are working with participants who need that clarity, it's part of building rapport. So open it up and explain to them, this is what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Communities will be very resistant when they think you are promising them the world. They think you're going to come and intervene and change everything there. So avoid making, hefty promises in terms of what this research is going to do. I think those are the things. Don't promise or make empty promises as well. The other, lastly, Tembeka, also speaking the language of the participants, breaking between English and the language of preference can also break those barriers. Okay.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your wonderful presentation. I can just imagine how your students must enjoy you in class. Honestly speaking, I really enjoyed it. I had a question regarding the emotions. So you've told us about the emotions that sometimes come up, especially with a sensitive topic. I was wondering, what would you do if you as a facilitator or interviewer become quite upset or emotional about what the participants is sharing with you? How do you go about that?
Okay. So this is a very, very, very interesting point. It's likely that at some point with your data collection, you are going to be stirred or you're going to be triggered, especially if the topic you are working on is something that resonates closely to you. Which is why as a supervisor, we're constantly asking our students, what does this topic actually mean for you and to you? I honestly don't tell my students to shy away from those emotions. It's to acknowledge it. It's to almost acknowledge it and to say, I'm feeling what you're feeling and this is what I feel, but let's engage with it a little more. Because for me, that's also rapport building. This is not a counseling setting where if you were in a counseling setting and you cried with your participant, I'd say that's a big no-no. But in a research setting, it could work, but it's also something you have to be very sensitive towards, in terms of why am I doing this and where is it coming from? Is it happening with every participant? Did it happen with just one? How did I manage and contain it? And also don't leave your participant open then in terms of that emotional state. Find a way to contain. As a researcher, if you cannot do that because you don't have the necessary skills, then make sure you have someone on your research team that you could refer the person to for post assistance. I hope that answers or assists.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, I see no more questions there.
We've got one more, I think.
Is there one more?
Yes.
Oh,
So it's not a question, Yasin. It's
Sure.
just something to add to what. It's just to add to what Vilma was asking about the researcher ending up with those emotions as well. And then just to alert to the fact that the pilot study helps a lot with that one. And then also, the actual, what do you call it? When you're writing up, so this morning's presentation was about that, about anticipating the limitations, but also having a section on the researcher's position.
Okay.
So then you give the, you give the details in respect of where you're coming from. So you unpack with your supervisor what would be the potential difficulties you might experience during the data collection process. I'm not sure, that might also just help.
100%. Sorry, that slipped my mind about the pilot study. Is with qualitative data, make sure you do a pilot first, because that pilot would help you and the supervisor to understand, are there any sensitivities, triggers, are the questions working, are they not working, and how to adapt that. So thank you for that. That was very good.
so we have one more question
Okay.
here.
Thanks, Prof, for the great presentation. So my question is sort of around, when would we include demographic variables in qualitative research? So often in quantitative research, we include demographic variables to develop associations, extrapolation, but in qualitative research, we don't do that. So, often, it's difficult to justify why we're including certain demographic variables, whether we should, I'm not saying we should. Is it for context, et cetera, So what's the thought behind that?
Absolutely. So look, for demographic variables, I think are very important when it comes to qualitative data. Even if you're working with 5 participants, participants, or 8 or 10, you need to understand who are the people, the age brackets, the gender, race, socioeconomics, etc. And the reason that's very important is it gives you an indication of which particular cohorts within that subsample or that particular population may be feeling certain things or certain perceptions. There could be a difference between males and females, for example. It could be between different careers, etc. So that's important, as it also gives more diversity to the data, and you can also then, I think the word I'm trying to use, I don't want to use a qualitative one, quantitative, is to stratify the sample more. So you can also identify and you can highlight more areas for further research. But when you are doing a qualitative study and investigation, it's very important to try to keep your sample demographics as closely linked as possible. Because if you have 2 individuals who are in their 20s and 3 who are in their 50s, it's very unlikely that you could do a full-on comparison, right? Or clump them all into one particular space. Because those perceptions as a 20-year-old are going to be significantly different based on where you are at later points or different developmental stages. Okay. I hope that helps. All right.